North America, 1982. It's a golden era for video games. In the arcades, Pac-Man was the highest grossing game for the third year in a row, which accumulated a total revenue of $6 billion worldwide. And in the home, the Atari VCS would enjoy games like Pitfall, Zaxxon and Q*bert. But in the UK, it was the emergence of home computers that started an entire revolution. The 8-bit micros were affordable, both in schools where the BBC Micro would occupy 80% of all classrooms, and in the home. These microcomputers were sold in stores like appliances, and it would be these same microcomputers that turned teenagers into die-hard programmers. Liverpool-based Imagine Software was one of the earliest software developers from the UK, founded in 1982 by David Lawson and Mark Butler, and quickly rose to prominence with their high-budget approach to packaging and advertising, which at the time was not commonplace. Full and double-page color ads in all popular computer magazines skyrocketed Imagine's popularity, and they initially backed it up by producing several successful games, including Arcadia for the Commodore VIC-20 and the ZX Spectrum. Imagine were doing something that no one else in the industry was, and the money soon began to flow. However, the company's early success would lead Imagine's founders to make poor business decisions. Young, naive and full of themselves, not many of these decisions had much to do with making games. Imagine spent money on company cars, huge luxurious offices, assistants, and even a racing team that rode motorcycles. More staff was hired, with an estimated 100 employees during the peak in 1983. At the time, Imagine were enjoying huge sales and success, and expanding at a rate of knots. Unfortunately, they felt that they were being damaged badly by software piracy, and as a preventative measure, they had an ace up their sleeve, an idea that no one else in the industry was doing, and it was called the Megagame. This would be a hardware add-on that would expand the computer's capabilities by providing additional memory and double up as an anti-piracy dongle. Because the hardware adds more memory, it meant that a conventional computer wouldn't be able to play these games. On paper, this was a genius idea, and two games were announced for the Megagames series, Bandersnatch and Cyclops. But the cost of these Megagames was high. Imagine priced them at 30 UK pounds, as compared to regular games at the time would cost you around £7. During the middle of 1983, Imagine had a money problem. They were still making a pile of money, but they were spending much more, and the debts started to mount. To figure out Imagine's finances, David and Mark would bring in Ian Hetherington to act as Imagine's financial director. Hetherington had no accounting background at all, but he had a strong business know-how and connections with local businesses in Liverpool. Hetherington could see the writing on the wall for Imagine, with the money quickly drying up, so he came up with an idea to save the Megagames, which he believed would be the future of video games at the time. He and David Lawson would form a company called Finchspeed, with a plan to poach the Imagine developers that were both loyal and had the talent to finish Bandersnatch, and convince Mark Butler, the other founder, to transfer ownership of the Megagames to Finchspeed. The game would still be developed in the Imagine offices, and in return, Finchspeed would need to pay Imagine £40,000 for the equipment they would use to develop the games, as well as pay 50% of net profits from the games to Imagine after their release. With mounting debts, Mark Butler agreed. The deal was done, and Finchspeed would take ownership. However, this deal was only as good as long as Imagine were in business. In July of 1984, due to mounting debt, Imagine went bankrupt, and because of UK law at the time stipulating that any company that's in a winding up petition could be cast aside, liquidators took control of the Megagames, and the Finchspeed deal was voided. It would be Sinclair Research, the company who developed the ZX Spectrum computer, who would then buy the rights to the Megagames for £100,000, and contracted Hetherington and Lawson to form a new company, FireIron, to bring the Megagames to Sinclair's new QL computer, a much more advanced machine over the Spectrum that had more memory and a 16-bit processor. By 1985, the partnership with Sinclair wasn't going well. Relations were strained, with Sinclair claiming FireIron was spending far too much money and target dates and deliverables were being missed. But Sinclair also had other problems. The QL was a flop, selling only 150,000 units, a drop in the bucket compared to the Spectrum, and by the end of 1985, Sinclair terminated its contract with FireIron. Undeterred, Hetherington and Lawson pushed forward. They believed that this megagame concept would change the industry. Burned by Sinclair and the failure of the QL, they now turned to the 16-bit Atari ST to put their megagames on. It shared the same CPU as the QL, the Motorola 68000, so porting the game wouldn't require a total rewrite. There was only one problem, however. Sinclair owned the rights to Bandersnatch and the megagames, so how would they get them back? Well, it wouldn't be hard. FireIron took Bandersnatch and called it Britakis instead, and they decided to end the megagame branding altogether. Luckily, Sinclair never caught wind of this. They were in the middle of selling their entire business to Amstrad by then, and had much bigger problems. In July of 1985, FireIron would change their name to Psygnosis, and Hetherington and Lawson would bring in Jonathan Ellis to manage finances and day-to-day operations of this new company. But it needed an identity and it needed a logo. Hetherington and Lawson would commission Roger Dean to create the famous Psygnosis Owl logo. Dean is an English artist, designer and publisher, and he began painting posters and album covers for musicians such as Yes, Asia and Uriah Heep. His style is airbrushed, with distinct fantasy otherworldly landscapes, and the owl logo is one of the most well-known in video games, even to this day. In 1986, the newly formed Psygnosis would finally complete their megagame, now known as Britakis, and release it on the Atari ST. In the game, you play as an engineer named Kine on the very first colonized asteroid named Britakis, in an attempt to clear your name for being falsely framed by the government for treason. Britakis is not a good game. At its core, it's a flip-screen action-adventure game that's controlled using mouse gestures. In other words, if you want to walk, you slide the mouse either to the left or to the right, and if you want to run in that direction, you flick the mouse instead. Interaction in the game is managed by speech bubbles and predetermined responses that you can pick from. Objects can only be interacted with either by picking them up or by dropping them in front of other players. The control system is poor, and the game was harshly criticized in its reviews. While the graphics were favorable for the time, the mouse control and sluggish performance made the gameplay almost impossible. After the Atari ST version, it was ported to the Commodore Amiga a few months later, and Psygnosis had already set up a distribution deal with Mindscape in the US. Britakis, if not for anything else, offered a new and unique gameplay experience, and unless you owned an Atari ST or Amiga at the time, you couldn't play it. This alone drove up interest in sales for the game, as well as more people upgrading to 16-bit microcomputers. 8-bit micros were starting to feel a little dated, and that Roger Dean artistry was the icing on the cake. Britakis would sell better than expected, enough to keep the lights on at least. And in those early days of the company, Hetherington and Lawson took on much of the programming duties themselves on some early titles, including Arena, a decent-looking track and field game with some sluggish gameplay, and Deep Space, a space trading combat game which again didn't control particularly well either. But in 1987, Psygnosis had their first real hit on their hands with Barbarian. Barbarian is another flip-screen action-adventure title programmed by Lawson that has you, as the young barbarian Hegor, on a quest to destroy the evil Necron, the monster that killed Hegor's father. The game is controlled by a predetermined set of action icons that you must click on to perform the action that you want. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of muscle memory here needed to remember the button combinations needed to get past a certain spot in the game. But the game has excellent 16-bit graphics, at least for the time, and had sample audio sound effects, which at the time was quite unheard of. The game also featured a lengthy opening animation sequence, something that became a signature of many Psygnosis games during those early days. Barbarian was a hit, and reviewers loved the game. Computer in Video Games gave it a 10 out of 10. At last they've done it. Psygnosis has written a game, a decent game, great graphics, brilliant sound, and for once, excellent gameplay. Hetherington, Lawson and Ellis realized that the best way to make it in this business with the rising popularity of 16-bit games was to keep the game simple and focus on spectacular visuals and presentation. At this point, all games and development were done in-house. Hetherington and Lawson had done most of the programming, but in order to expand, they needed to bring in outside development resources. The UK was full of talented developers and owned machines like the Amiga and Atari ST. These machines were open platforms where anyone could make their own games, and Psygnosis decided it was time to move into publishing, but not before Lawson's final game developed in-house would be released. Obliterator is very much a David Lawson game, with a very similar flick-screen action-adventure and icon system to control the main character, just like Barbarian. The controls weren't particularly great, but the graphics were superb, and the music is some of the very best on the Amiga, composed by David Whittaker. The overall package, with the Roger Dean artwork, was brilliant. With external development partners, it became important for the studio to maintain a uniform art style across their games, and for this, they would put together an internal art team, who were comprised of some of the very best illustrators and animators of the entire industry. This team was hired with little to no computer experience, but this wouldn't be a problem. Psygnosis wanted the best, and training them on how to use software packages like Deluxe Paint was the easy part. The internal art team would often work with their outside development partners to provide the final touch-ups to many Psygnosis games, providing graphics and animations for the intros, outros, and in-game visuals. Psygnosis were now running a hybrid model, both developing, but more importantly, publishing games. Hetherington had an eye for talent, but wanted only the best, and the best is what he got. DMA Design was founded by David Jones when he was just 23. He signed a 6-game deal with Psygnosis in 1987. Menace would be the first game from the studio, releasing in 1988, after 18 months of development. The game was released on the Cyclops label, which would be a smaller publishing label within Psygnosis itself. Incidentally, Cyclops is the name of the second mega game from the Imagine days, which never saw the light of day. The legacy of the Megagames lived on. Menace is a horizontal shoot 'em up, which was something that was quite popular at the time. Technically, it's impressive running on a stock Amiga 500. The game itself, it's not too bad, but there's nothing great about it either. But it does control better than most Psygnosis games did at the time. Menace would feature another fantastic David Whittaker soundtrack, and Roger Dean once again would complete the packaging. Incidentally, David Jones and DMA Design would release some of the source code to Menace as part of the February 1990 edition of the Amiga Format magazine. The 7-part series was known as The Whole Truth About Games Programming, and goes into technical detail about how Menace was developed on the Amiga, with source code from the game provided on the Amiga Format cover disc. If you're interested in Amiga games programming, it's a compelling read. But DMA Design's next game, and the 1989 sequel to Menace known as Blood Money, was more like it. It's another horizontal scrolling shoot 'em up with some twists and turns along the way, but technically and gameplay wise, it was a vast improvement. Menace used hardware scrolling, but Blood Money used the Amiga's powerful Blittercode processor to handle all scrolling and graphics display. This meant that the game could use more colors, and a new scrolling system was built just for the game. In Blood Money, you take control of various different vehicles, a helicopter, submarine, spacesuit, and a fighter jet, and each vehicle has unique weaponry, and the player can upgrade their vehicles with power-ups. It was generally a well-received game, and it sold around 40,000 copies, twice as much as Menace. Blood Money would see ports to the Atari ST, MS-DOS, and the Commodore 64. There would also be an unreleased Sega Mega Drive port that never saw the light of day. 1989 would be a pivotal year for Psygnosis. You had DMA Design with their shoot-'em-ups, and a new development studio known as Reflections would partner with Psygnosis and release their first game, Ballistics. Ballistics was a future sports game, which at that point was quite popular. 1 year earlier, the Bitmap brothers released Speedball to critical acclaim. Ballistics then would have a very similar aesthetic look with its metallic playfield. It was developed by Martin Edmondson, and it wasn't a bad little game. With the mouse, the player controls a cursor that can fire a stream of small balls. You use these small balls to direct a puck across the court and score a goal. Once you've scored 3 goals, you win the round. And there's 130 rounds in total. And while the game is quite boring as a single-player game, with 2 players it can be fun. While the gameplay was once again a little bit lacking, the graphics and presentation was superb. And this would just be the beginning. 1989's Shadow of the Beast is known to be the killer app for the Commodore Amiga. This is the game that you would show off to your friends who owned any other computer and laugh at their inferiority. Beast is a mind-blowing tech demo of the Amiga's capabilities. It features not 1, but 13 separate parallax scrolling layers that all scroll smoothly. It features massive sprites, incredible graphics with over 128 colors on screen at once, thanks to the Amiga's copper chip, and it all ran on a stock Amiga 500 with just 512 kilobytes of memory. It uses the Amiga's dual playfield mode to manage much of the parallax layering, and came complete with Roger Dean artwork, a t-shirt, the game on 2 discs, a manual, all for 35 UK pounds. But unlike the failed Bandersnatch Megagame, Beast was a smash hit. The game was developed by only 3 people, Martin Edmondson, Paul Howarth, and David Whittaker, who had composed the music. As a game, Beast is middle of the road. It's a fantasy action adventure side-scroller that's brutally difficult. As a technical showcase for the Amiga, it's a masterpiece. The Reflections team themselves admitted that the game was designed to push the hardware first. Edmondson would say, "We couldn't get away with it now. It was definitely a case of being in the right place at the right time." Apart from how many colors and layers of parallax and monsters we could squeeze on screen, no thought went into it whatsoever. Shadow of the Beast sold very well, and everyone wanted to play it. And there were various ports to other consoles and computers, but the Amiga version stood above them all. Notable port was the Commodore 64 version, which apart from the limits of the hardware itself, was brilliant, recapturing the essence of the original game. Psygnosis were firing on all cylinders. The strategic move to work with outside developers was paying off, and this transformation would be pivotal in setting up Psygnosis for success, but not without consequence. In 1989, the same year as Shadow of the Beast, David Lawson, the original co-founder of the company, departed. It's not exactly known why this occurred, as Psygnosis were very tight-lipped and rarely talked to the media, but according to some reports, Lawson was dissatisfied with the company's new direction into publishing and felt that his role as co-founder had diminished. Hetherington and Ellis were leading the charge, and Lawson would leave and start a new company, Connectica. His company would release one game, a flick-screen action-adventure title called The Gold of the Aztecs. It wasn't a bad game, but nothing great either. Lawson would then depart the video game industry completely after 1990. Hetherington and Ellis pushed forward. The company was never afraid to look at emerging technology and think of ways to enhance games. In 1990, CD technology in games didn't exist, but Hetherington would set up an in-house team to research CD-ROM technology and applications. "We are looking for alternative uses for CD. You have to throw your existing thinking in the bin, then go sit in the middle of a field and start again from scratch. Most developers will evolve into CD. They will go from 5 megabyte products to 10 megabyte products with studio quality soundtracks. And that will be what characterizes CD products for the next few years." Hetherington was exactly right. This in-house team was known as the Advanced Technology Group, funded by the profits Psygnosis were bringing in from their games, with the goal to understand CD-ROM technology and how to apply it to games, and more importantly, be right there when the time came. It's worth noting here that the advanced technology groups are commonplace in many big tech and game companies. Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft all have them. Psygnosis were the original pioneers. In 1990 would see the release of two more pivotal games, Shadow of the Beast 2, the follow-up to the original game, which featured a lengthy hand-drawn animated intro that really puts you into the mood, and has 8-way smooth scrolling, and as a result, the 13-level parallax scrolling has been toned down a bit. Shadow of the Beast 2 is more of a story-driven game with puzzles and a simple conversation system. It's brutally difficult, and unfair at times with soft locks if you don't play the game correctly. It's worth a look just for the graphics, and the soundtrack was composed by Tim and Lee Wright. The game once again came on a big box with Roger Dean artwork and 2 floppy disks. As an overall experience and package, it's memorable, but there's really not much else here. Still, it doesn't matter. Fans of Beast and Psygnosis picked it up, and it sold very well. The Killing Game Show, on the other hand, is one of the better Psygnosis games. It's a simple formula. You play as an Ed 219 looking robot and must keep moving vertically up the top of the stage to advance without the deadly to organic life liquid getting you first. Your robot character has a weapon that can be powered up, and there's traps, keys to unlock new sections, and even liquid freezer to stop the rising liquid. The Killing Game Show had all the gameplay in the world, and once again, an incredible package with animated intro and a superb Tim Wright soundtrack. The outside development studio responsible was Raising Hell Software, with Martin Chudley, the lead programmer on the game. Raising Hell was the first iteration of a studio who would later become Bizarre Creations, and once again Psygnosis were the first to put their money behind the talent. By now, Psygnosis were an established studio with several bona fide hits, an extremely talented lineup of outside development resources, internal art and research teams that were mostly funded by the profits of their own games, but what came next changed the trajectory of the studio permanently. DMA Design would release their third game, Lemmings, in 1991, originally for the Amiga and the Atari ST. It's a puzzle strategy game where you must guide a group of lemmings to the designated exit of each level and before the timer runs out. Getting to the exit is done by selecting one of 8 different skills. Levels in the game include a variety of obstacles that prevent lemmings from reaching the exit. Large drops, booby traps, and pools of lava all stand in your way. The origins of the game came from artist and programmer Mike Daly in 1989, where he was playing around with a small set of animated 8x8 pixel characters in deluxe paint. The original concepts were part of development for a sequel to Blood Money known as Walker, but after showing his work to other team members, they decided to construct an entire game around the concept. The team put together a small demo and showed it to Psygnosis in late 1989. Lemmings is a masterpiece. It's addictive today to pick up and play as it was in 1991. It would sell 55,000 copies on its first day. Lemmings would see over 20 different ports to different systems, and it was estimated to have sold at least 15 million units and as much as 20 million on the high end. And Psygnosis would cleverly cross-promote their other games in Lemmings, with special crossover levels which featured backgrounds and music from games such as Menace, Shadow of the Beast 1 and 2, as well as reflections of the game known as Awesome. To cap it off, it featured 2-player split screen with a second Amiga mouse plugged into port 2. Lemmings was the game that elevated Psygnosis to the big leagues, and the games kept coming. Traveller's Tales would be another well-known studio that would get their start at Psygnosis. Formed in 1989 by John Burton, their first game, Leander, released in 1991 on the Amiga, and once again, it was Psygnosis at their very best. The player assumes the role of the legendary knight Leander as they battle through many different stages to rescue the princess Lucana from the wizard Thanatos. Leander is a pretty good game. It features 8-way smooth scrolling with parallax, a shop and upgrade system, and it's one of the earliest Amiga games that took cues from consoles by supporting 2 buttons. Now, to be clear, the Amiga technically can use 2 fire buttons, and this is something that was built into the hardware right from the beginning. In platform games on the Amiga, many were used to pressing up on the joystick to jump, which never felt great. Leander has a 2-button option with 1 button to attack and the second button to jump, which is much more in line with game consoles. Music and audio, as usual, were composed by Tim Wright, and as is Psygnosis tradition by now, an impressive animated intro sequence and Roger Dean artwork to cap everything off. The game comes complete on 3 floppy disks and runs on an unexpanded Amiga. Technically, it's a brilliant showcase, but it may be a touch repetitive on the gameplay side. Just like DMA Design, Reflections, and Raising Hell Software, Traveller's Tales would rise to bigger and much better things. Psygnosis saw the talent before anyone else in the industry, and they gave them the tools to be successful. Although Psygnosis were predominantly a publisher, they would still develop games in-house, notably 1991's Barbarian 2, the sequel to David Lawson's original 1987 title. This time around, it was programmed by Mike Chilton, who would go on to have a very successful career in the games industry. Barbarian 2 did away with the mouse icon controlled gameplay to make it a much more accessible experience. In a vacuum, Barbarian 2 is a fun game and a worthy sequel, with a good combination of action and some puzzles along the way. The main problem, however, with Barbarian 2 is that in 1987, a game like this was mind-blowing, but by 1991, the bar had well and truly been raised. Case in point, the Bitmap Brothers' Gods was now the standard of what Amiga owners expected from a platform game. 1992 would be an important year for Psygnosis, and of course, there were more games. Shadow of the Beast 3 by Reflections was an exclusive Amiga-only title that focused much more on better gameplay and game design. According to Martin Edmondson, when we did Beast 1, the whole point was that nobody had done anything like it before, so we went all out for the number of layers of parallax scrolling. But now that we've done that, and everyone else has done that as well, there's really no point in saying that we've got 15 layers of parallax and stuff. It just doesn't mean anything. Shadow of the Beast 3 didn't have 15 layers of parallax, but it was still technically brilliant. The game was rewritten from scratch, with none of the original Beast 1 and 2 code being used. The original code for Beast 1 was so bad, it was the first thing we really did seriously, and when you look back at it, it's very slow and inefficient, and could have been done many times better. We always like to start from scratch. Shadow of the Beast 3 is still very much a beast game, with large colourful graphics, a familiar Tim Wright soundtrack with light panpipes, low bass and xylophone arrangements, but Reflections would finally crack the formula. Beast 3 was the best in the series. 1992's Agony, developed by Art and Magic, was some of the most impressive pieces of Amiga programming at the time. As soon as you launch the game, the classically themed Tim Wright piano sequence is beautiful. The game itself is set in a fantasy universe and is a love letter to all fans of Psygnosis. You control an owl, who is not only the mascot for the company itself, it's also superbly animated. The goal of Agony is simple: Defeat all the enemies in your way across 6 separate stages without losing all your lives. Compared to other horizontal shooters like R-Type and Gradius, Agony isn't very good, but as a Psygnosis and Amiga game, it leaves its impression on you. Once again, beautiful hand-drawn 2D artwork, large sprites, smooth parallax scrolling. You can't help but sit back and play the game just to experience the graphics and the sound. While Psygnosis were releasing hit after hit, their advanced technology group was hard at work. Given the task by Hetherington to research CD technology in video games just a few years earlier, Commodore would release their CDTV in 1991. The CDTV was an attempt to capitalize at emerging home multimedia markets and compete with the Philips CDI. The CDTV looks like a stereo system component that would live in your entertainment rack, but for all intents and purposes, it was just an Amiga 500 computer with a CD-ROM drive. Its emergence was during an interesting time. Mike Clark, who worked at Psygnosis as a full-time musician, would go on to say, throughout the period of moving from the Amiga into CD-ROM technology, it felt like no one really knew what was going to happen. There was a definite paradigm shift going on in games, but where it was going to end up was very difficult to predict. After all, it was still very far from mainstream at that point. What was clear was that we were involved in something very new indeed. The first public demonstration of this research would bear fruit in 1991, with a small demo that accompanied the CDTV version of Lemmings, as well as on a separate CDTV demo disc. The intro boasts, "What you are about to see is a prototype of a future interactive experience. The following is a taste of things to come." The demo for a game known as Planetside was not playable, but would show a full motion video of a jet fighter in low altitude flying through the desert. This jaw-dropping demo was simply not possible on floppy disk-based computers. Nothing like this had ever been made before, and Psygnosis would also feature more of their demonstrations on the CDTV demo disc. Planetside would never end up being made. There was no more than this intro, and the game would be cancelled in 1993. But not the technology and the years of research. That would carry forward to Psygnosis' first CD-ROM based title that released on the Amiga CD32, the successor to the CDTV, as well as the Fujitsu FM Towns, the Sega CD, the Panasonic 3DO, and MS-DOS. The game, known as Microcosm, would be a 3D shooter on rails, however, with pre-rendered full-motion video backgrounds rather than super-scaled sprites, and the game would fill up an entire 600 megabyte CD-ROM. In 1993, this was groundbreaking. The game would show its capabilities of CD-ROM technology, with realistic pre-rendered graphics developed on Silicon Graphics workstations, complete with lengthy full-motion video intro sequences and CD audio music produced by Rick Wakeman. Microcosm in a vacuum isn't a particularly good game, but it's one of the most important titles ever produced. It's often cited as the first AAA title on CD-ROM, signifying its high production value and ambition. And it was a taste of things to come.